I walked into my family hotel gala to celebrate our 30-year legacy, only to hear my stepmother shout across the lobby, "Security, remove her immediately." I turned around and left without a single word of protest. But hours later, I moved the hotel the land it sat on, and $23 million in cash, directly into my private trust. Within minutes, 79 missed calls lit up my phone. By midnight, they were begging at my door. I am Gabrielle. I am 32 years old, working as a corporate attorney specializing in trust structures and acquisitions here in Chicago. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up in a wealthy household meant privilege to outsiders, but inside our sprawling estate, emotional coldness permeated every corner. My childhood was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. Tonight was supposed to be a massive milestone. The Holloway Hotel was throwing its 30th anniversary gala. This building was the crown jewel of my family, started by my grandmother Hattie before my father took over the daily operations. I wore the vintage black velvet dress that once belonged to my late mother. It was a subtle nod to the true origins of our family's success, a silent tribute to the woman who was erased from our family history. The moment I stepped through the revolving glass doors and into the grand lobby, the scent of expensive orchids and imported champagne washed over me. Flashbulbs went off near the red carpet as local politicians, wealthy investors, and Chicago socialites mingled. I smoothed my dress and took a deep breath, ready to endure a few hours of fake smiles for the sake of appearances. I did not even make it to the ballroom. Vivian, my stepmother, spotted me from across the marble floor. She was 55 years old, but dressed like she was attending her own coronation, draped in an obnoxious emerald green gown that I knew cost more than the hotel catering budget. Her eyes locked onto me, cold and incredibly calculating. She whispered something to the event coordinator, then marched directly into my path, effectively blocking my way to the coat check. "What are you doing here, Gabrielle?" She hissed, her voice low enough to avoid a massive scene, but sharp enough to cut glass. I looked at her, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "I am here for the anniversary gala, Vivian. I received an invitation just like everyone else did." She scoffed, crossing her arms tightly. The heavy diamond bracelets on her wrists caught the light sparkling aggressively. That invitation was a mere formality sent by the Public Relations Department. "You are not actually welcome here tonight. This is an exclusive event for our real family and our major financial investors. We do not need you ruining the luxurious aesthetic with your bitter energy and your dead mother-old clothes." I felt a hot flash of anger burn in my chest, but I pushed it down instantly. I never gave Vivian the satisfaction of seeing me upset. The dress is vintage Vivian, but I suppose money cannot buy taste or class. Now, if you will excuse me, I am going to get a drink from the bar. I stepped to the side to bypass her, but she lunged forward and grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her acrylic nails digging painfully into my bare skin. I looked down at her hand, then slowly brought my eyes back up to meet her furious gaze. "Remove your hand from my arm," I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady. Vivian let go, but her face flushed bright red with pure rage. She realized people were starting to stare at us. Several guests holding crystal champagne flutes had paused their conversations to watch the unfolding drama. Instead of backing down to save face, Vivian decided to double down on her cruelty. She turned toward the main entrance and snapped her fingers loudly at the head of security. "Marcus!" She called out, her shrill voice echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings of the lobby. "Come here right now!" Two large men in dark suits hurried over immediately. They recognized me right away. I had known them for years, greeting them every time I visited the property. They looked incredibly uncomfortable stepping into a family dispute. "Yes, Mrs. Holloway," the taller guard asked nervously, avoiding direct eye contact with me. "Security, remove her," Vivian ordered, pointing a manicured finger right at my face. "She is trespassing on private property. I want her escorted off the premises this instant." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over our section of the grand lobby. The string quartet playing beautifully in the background suddenly sounded incredibly far away. Whispers broke out among the wealthy guests. I could feel hundreds of judgmental eyes burning into my back. This was exactly what Vivian wanted all along. She wanted to humiliate me publicly to show everyone that she was the absolute authority of the Holloway Empire, and that the daughter of the first wife was nothing but an unwanted stray dog. "Mrs. Holloway," the guard stammered, shifting his weight. "This is Gabrielle. She is Mr. Holloway's oldest daughter. I do not care who she is." Vivian practically shrieked, completely losing her composed high society facade. "She is not a shareholder. She does not work for the management company. And she is not welcome at my party. Escort her out right now or I will fire both of you on the spot." I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight. I looked around the massive lobby searching for my father. I knew he was here somewhere. Surely he would step in and put a stop to this absolute insanity. But as my eyes scanned the wealthy crowd, I saw the true reality of my situation. People were either looking away in secondhand embarrassment or watching with eager, toxic fascination. Nobody was going to intervene. "Gabrielle, please," the security guard whispered, stepping closer to me with a pleading look. "Do not make us do this physically. Just step outside for a few minutes until she calms down." I looked at the guard, seeing the genuine apology in his eyes. He was just a working man trying to keep his job to feed his family. I was not going to make a violent scene and put him in a terrible position. I turned my undivided attention back to Vivian. She was smirking now, a triumphant, ugly smile that twisted her features. She thought she had won. She thought this public expulsion was her ultimate power move. "You are making a massive mistake, Vivian," I said softly, ensuring only she could hear the absolute promise of destruction in my tone. "Get out," she mouthed back silently, pointing dramatically toward the glass doors. I did not argue. I did not scream or throw my drink. I simply adjusted my designer clutch, turned my back on the woman who had tormented me since I was 15 years old, and walked toward the exit. The confident clicking of my heels on the polished marble floor sounded exactly like the ticking of a dangerous time bomb. As I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped out into the chilly Chicago night air, I felt a strange sense of absolute clarity. They had drawn the battle lines tonight. They had deliberately chosen public humiliation. Now it was my turn to play. I stood under the grand awning of the hotel waiting for the valet to bring my vehicle. The cold wind from Lake Michigan whipped around me, but my blood was running too hot to feel the chill. The heavy glass doors behind me pushed open, and a familiar, obnoxious laugh echoed against the concrete. It was Spencer. My golden child half-sister Brielle was clinging to his arm. They had followed me outside just to ensure they got the final word. "Well, if it is not the angry sister storming off," Spencer said loudly. He wore a tuxedo that fit him poorly but cost more than most people made in a decade. He walked up to me with that signature arrogant smirk he always wore around my family. I kept my eyes fixed on the street. "I have nothing to say to you, Spencer." "Oh, come on, Gabby, do not be like that," he chuckled condescendingly. He took a sip from his Scotch glass, entirely ignoring the valet staff rushing past us. "You know you really brought this on yourself. Vivian is just protecting the brand. We have highly influential investors here tonight, and frankly, your whole bitter energy is bad for business. You always have to play the victim, do you not? It is such a predictable trope for you people." I slowly turned my head. You people. That was Spencer in a nutshell. He was a mediocre white man who inherited his initial wealth from his father's mid-level real estate firm. He loved dropping microaggressions wrapped in corporate business jargon. He viewed the Holloway legacy not as a proud Black-owned enterprise that my grandmother built from the ground up, but as a distressed asset he was doing a charitable favor by touching. He had once mentioned at a Thanksgiving dinner that the hotel needed to distance itself from its urban demographic to attract a more refined clientele. I knew exactly what he meant by that. Brielle giggled, leaning her head against his shoulder. Her blonde highlights caught the glow of the street lamps. "Honestly, Gabby, why do you even try to fit in with us? Look at you. You are wearing a dress from 30 years ago. It smells like a thrift store. You are a corporate lawyer, but you still look like you are begging for a handout. It is completely embarrassing for Dad to have you seen by his high-profile friends." Spencer nodded in agreement, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. That is exactly it, Brielle. Gabby, you have to understand how the real world works. My private equity fund is about to acquire a majority stake in this hotel. I am bringing real value and real capital to the table. We are elevating this place from a dated local business to a modern luxury portfolio. You do not understand high-level finance because you are just pushing paperwork for someone else. You got your little law firm job through a diversity quota, and you think you are intellectually superior to us. It is pathetic. You really think you can stand shoulder to shoulder with the big players. I looked at the two of them. They were a perfect match of entitlement and delusion. Brielle was 27 and held a fake title as Director of Public Relations. She spent her days at the spa and shopping on our father corporate credit card. She had absolutely no idea how close to the edge her glamorous life actually was. And Spencer was a vulture capitalist, running a shell game playing the wealthy savior to a family he secretly despised. Is that what you honestly think, Spencer? I asked calmly, my voice carrying clearly over the sound of the traffic. You think you are saving my family legacy by buying it out for pennies on the dollar and rebranding it to suit your fragile ego. I know I am saving it, he said, stepping closer into my personal space, trying to use his height against me. He lowered his voice, trying to sound physically intimidating. You resent me because I am a successful white man taking over what you stubbornly think should be yours by birthright. But let us be honest here. Your father ran this place into the ground. He needs me. Vivian needs me. Brielle needs me. Without my fund injecting cash tonight, this whole property would be bankrupt and foreclosed by the end of the year. So stop acting like a jealous outsider. You are lucky we even let you keep the Holloway name attached to your little law practice. Brielle smirked, running a manicured hand down her custom silk gown. You should just go home, Gabby. Go back to your empty apartment and your lonely life. You do not have a husband. You do not have any real money. Stop trying to insert yourself where you do not belong. We are the future of Holloway hotels. You are just a forgotten mistake from a past Dad desperately wants to erase. Her words were designed to hurt, but they just bounced right off my armor. For years, I had listened to this exact same rhetoric. I had watched them flaunt their luxury cars and lavish vacations while I worked 80-hour weeks building my expertise in trust law and asset management. They saw my silence as weakness. They mistook my absence for defeat. They had no idea that I spent the last 10 years meticulously studying every single financial document associated with this family. You are absolutely right, Brielle, I said, offering a small, perfectly measured smile. I do not belong here tonight. You and Spencer deserve exactly what is coming to you. Enjoy the champagne, enjoy the applause of the crowd. Take plenty of pictures so you can remember this night forever. Spencer laughed, a harsh, grating sound that cut through the city noise. Are you threatening us with a lawsuit or something, Gabby? Please do not make me laugh. I have the best attorneys in Chicago on retainer. My legal team would crush you before you even filed the paperwork. You have no leverage in this situation. You have no equity in the company. You have absolutely nothing. You cannot touch me or this hotel. At that exact moment, the valet pulled my black luxury SUV up to the curb. The tires quietly kissed the pavement. I tipped the driver with a crisp $100 bill and confidently opened my own door. I do not need to sue you, Spencer, I said, looking back at his smug face one last time. I do not need leverage over a sinking ship. I just need to stand back and watch it go under. Have a wonderful evening celebrating your massive success. I am sure your investors will be thrilled with the final outcome. I climbed into the plush leather seat and shut the heavy car door, severing their toxic laughter from my world. Through the tinted window, I saw Spencer rolling his eyes and muttering something to Brielle before leading her back inside the warm, luxurious lobby. They were walking straight back to a party that was effectively over. I started the engine and drove away from the dazzling lights of the Holloway Hotel. I navigated the busy Chicago streets with perfect calm. My hands resting on the steering wheel did not shake. My heart beat in a steady, rhythmic pace. They thought they had finally put me in my place. They thought they had successfully expelled the unwanted daughter and secured their stolen empire. But they were entirely wrong. The real game had not even started yet. I merged onto the highway heading toward my penthouse, knowing that in less than an hour, everything they thought they owned would be legally mine. I had barely merged onto the highway when my dashboard screen flashed with an incoming call. It was my father, David Holloway, the man who had stood silently somewhere in that massive ballroom while his wife and stepchildren humiliated his own flesh and blood. Against my better judgment, I pressed the answer button on my steering wheel, letting his voice fill the quiet cabin of my car. "Gabby, please tell me you have not gone far." His voice sounded breathless and panicked through the speakers. "I am standing outside at the service exit on the west side of the building. Pull your car around to the loading dock right now. We need to talk about what just happened in there. Please just give me 5 minutes to make this right." I should have kept driving. I knew exactly who my father was. He was a chronic coward who always chose the path of least resistance, especially when it came to Vivian. But a small, naive part of me, the little girl who still remembered him reading me bedtime stories before my mother passed away, wanted to see if he would finally stand up for me. I wanted to see if there was any shred of the man my grandmother Hattie had trusted with her legacy. I took the next exit, circled the downtown block, and pulled my vehicle into the dimly lit service alley behind the massive hotel. It was a stark contrast to the glamorous red carpet entrance. Here, the air smelled of exhaust and damp cardboard. The only light came from a flickering yellow security bulb above the heavy metal doors. My father was pacing back and forth next to a row of commercial dumpsters. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost $5,000, but standing out here in the shadows, he just looked small and incredibly tired. I parked the car, leaving the engine running, and stepped out into the cold night air. I did not walk toward him. I let him come to me. "Gabby, thank God you came back," he said, rushing over with a nervous look on his face. He kept glancing nervously over his shoulder at the service doors as if he was terrified Vivian might suddenly appear and catch him talking to his own daughter. "I am so sorry about the scene in the lobby. You know how Vivian gets when she is stressed about these big corporate events. She is just highly protective of the brand image right now." I stared at him, letting his pathetic excuses hang in the damp air. Protective of the brand image, I repeated, my voice devoid of any warmth. "She called me a stray dog, Dad. She had security threaten to physically remove me from a building that bears my last name. And where were you exactly while your wife and her golden children were treating me like a criminal?" He sighed, running a hand over his graying hair. He looked down at the concrete, unable to meet my eyes. I was in the main ballroom talking to the press. By the time I heard what was happening, you were already walking out the front doors. "You have to understand, Gabby, this merger with Spencer Private Equity Fund is the most important deal of my entire life. We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. The investors are all here tonight. We cannot afford any family drama leaking to the media." "Family drama," I said, shaking my head slowly. "Is that what you call it when your wife systematically erases your firstborn child from existence?" "I am not drama, Dad. I am your daughter. Or at least I used to be." He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. He held it out to me with a pleading look in his eyes. "Look, I know you are hurt, and I know things have not been fair to you. But I need you to just disappear for a little while, just until the merger is finalized and the ink is dry on the contracts. I wrote you a check. It is for $10,000. Take it and go take a nice vacation. Go to Paris or Milan. Buy yourself some new clothes. Just stay away from the hotel and do not speak to the press." I looked down at the white envelope extended toward me. $10,000. It was an absolute insult. It was hush money meant to sweep me under the rug so he could play the role of the perfect patriarch for his new white investors. He was literally trying to pay me to leave through the service exit like the trash he believed I was. I did not yell. I did not cry. The tears I might have shed for my father had dried up over a decade ago. Instead, I felt a profound sense of liberation. This was the final confirmation I needed. Any lingering guilt I had about what I was about to do to him completely evaporated in that cold alleyway. I reached out and took the envelope from his trembling hand. A look of immense relief washed over his face. He actually thought I was accepting his pathetic bribe. He thought $10,000 was enough to buy my silence and my dignity. Thank you, Gabby. He sighed, offering a weak, apologetic smile. I promise I will make it up to you once the dust settles. We will have a quiet dinner, just the two of us. I opened the envelope and pulled out the heavy cardstock check. I looked at his messy signature at the bottom. Then, without breaking eye contact, I grabbed the check with both hands and ripped it straight down the middle. I stacked the two halves together and ripped them again, letting the shredded pieces of paper flutter to the dirty, wet concrete between his expensive leather shoes. His mouth dropped open in shock. "Gabby, what are you doing?" he gasped, looking down at the torn pieces of his bribe. "I am not going to Paris, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register. "And I am definitely not disappearing so you can sell off Grandmother Hattie's legacy to a vulture like Spencer. You have spent the last 17 years letting Vivian treat me like an unwanted burden while you stood by and did absolutely nothing. You chose her. You chose Brielle. You chose Spencer. You chose everyone except me." He took a step back, raising his hands defensively. "You are being irrational, Gabby. You do not understand the financial pressure I am under." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I replied, a cold smile slowly forming on my lips. "I understand that you built a house of cards, and now you are terrified of the wind. But you do not need to worry about me causing a scene at your little party. I am completely finished here." I turned around and walked back to my vehicle. The satisfying sound of my heels echoing off the brick walls felt like a judge banging a final gavel. "Gabby, wait," he called out, his voice sounding small and desperate. "Where are you going?" I opened my car door and looked back at him one last time. He looked like a pathetic, broken man standing alone among the garbage bins. "I'm going home, Dad," I said smoothly. "Have a great night, and good luck with your big merger. You are going to need it." I climbed inside, shut the door, and shifted the car into drive. As I pulled out of the alley and merged back onto the neon-lit streets of Chicago, I felt lighter than I had in years. The emotional anchor of my family had finally been cut. There was nothing holding me back anymore. It was time to execute the final stage of my plan. It was time to take back what was rightfully mine. I drove through the neon-lit streets of downtown Chicago, letting the rhythm of the city wash over me. The heavy knot of tension that had sat in my stomach all evening slowly dissolved. I did not head straight to my apartment building. Instead, I pulled into a secluded VIP parking level of an upscale private club where I held a membership. The concrete walls offered complete silence, and the heavy steel security gates ensured absolutely no one could follow me. I put the vehicle in park and killed the engine. The silence inside the cabin was deafening, but it was the exact kind of peace I needed for what came next. I reached into the back seat and grabbed my leather briefcase. I placed it on the passenger seat and carefully pulled out my laptop. The screen illuminated my face in the dark interior, casting a pale blue glow over the vintage velvet dress my mother had left me. I connected to my secure mobile hotspot and opened a highly encrypted private browser. My fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, typing in a web address that existed entirely off the grid. It was the secure portal for the Holloway Legacy Trust. This was the ultimate secret my grandmother Hattie had taken to her grave. Grandma Hattie was a brilliant visionary. She built the Holloway Hotel empire from a single dilapidated boarding house back in the 1970s. She was tough and uncompromising, and she saw right through people. She loved my father because he was her son, but she knew he was inherently weak. She knew he was easily swayed by flashy things and manipulative people. When my father married Vivian, my grandmother saw the writing on the wall. She knew Vivian would eventually try to strip the family of everything we owned to feed her own insatiable greed. So before she passed away, Hattie made a brilliant tactical move that my father was too arrogant to ever question. I had spent my entire adult life preparing for this exact moment. While Brielle was busy buying designer handbags and Spencer was playing golf with vulture capitalists, I was studying corporate law. I graduated at the top of my class and spent grueling hours learning the intricate details of real estate acquisitions and blind trusts. I did it all so I could properly protect the legacy that Hattie had entrusted to me. She knew I was the only one in the family who had the discipline to execute her final wishes. She recognized my mother in me. She recognized strength. When my father took over the business, he assumed he was inheriting the entire empire, but Hattie only gave him the operating company. She quietly separated the physical land and the actual building from the hospitality business. She placed the real estate into a blind trust. My father and Vivian owned the right to manage the hotel and collect revenue from the guests, but they had to pay a massive monthly lease to the trust for the privilege of using the property. For the first few years, my father paid the lease on time. But when Vivian started demanding more luxury vacations and expensive renovations, my father quietly stopped paying the trust. He assumed, because it was a family holding company, nobody would ever come collecting the debt. He thought he was untouchable. Vivian had convinced my father that the trust was just a useless legal formality. She told him that keeping the money in their operating account was a better business strategy. She wanted that capital to fund her lavish lifestyle, her endless charity galas, and her ridiculous wardrobe. They operated under the arrogant assumption that because I was just the quiet stepdaughter, I would never have the legal authority or the financial literacy to challenge them. They fundamentally misunderstood who I was. What my father did not know was that Hattie had designated me as the sole beneficiary and the ultimate trustee. The documents were locked tight until my 32nd birthday. I had turned 32 last month. For the past 4 weeks, I had been quietly working with a team of elite corporate auditors, tracing every single missed payment, every late fee, and every hidden clause in that original lease agreement. My father had defaulted on his lease for 10 straight years. Under the strict terms, my grandmother had outlined a decade of unpaid rent triggered a catastrophic penalty clause. I stared at the login screen. I typed in my password and hit enter. The screen loaded, displaying a stark white dashboard with black text. "Welcome, Gabrielle Holloway," the system read. I navigated to the primary asset management tab. The numbers staring back at me were staggering. The accumulated debt, including the lease breach penalties, compounded interest, and late fees totaled exactly $23 million. That was virtually every cent of liquid cash my father's operating company held in their corporate reserve accounts. It was the exact money Spencer was planning to leverage for his predatory buyout. I moved my cursor over to the execution protocol. The system prompted me with a final warning asking if I wanted to initiate the default collection process and seize the underlying assets. I thought about Vivian standing in the lobby in her ridiculous green dress, demanding security throw me out. I thought about Spencer mocking my intelligence and reducing my heritage to a cheap punchline. I thought about my father handing me a $10,000 check and asking me to leave through the garbage alley. They thought they held all the power because they controlled the guest list to a party. They had no idea they did not even own the floor they were standing on. I did not hesitate for a single second. I pressed the execute button. A small loading wheel spun on the screen for what felt like an eternity. Then a solid green checkmark appeared. Transfer initiated, the text read. Ownership of the downtown Chicago parcel had officially reverted from the holding company directly into my personal private estate. At the exact same moment, a secondary command was sent to the central banking network. $23 million was automatically swept from the Holloway operating accounts directly into my highly secured trust account to settle the decade of unpaid debt. Paid. The digital transfer was completely automated. There was no bank manager they could bribe to stop it. There was no lawyer Spencer could call to file a last-minute injunction. The smart contract my grandmother lawyers had built was ironclad. It bypassed all standard holding periods and executed the penalty sweep instantaneously. The money moved through the digital ether, quietly draining the lifeblood out of the Holloway Hotel Management Company. I watched the balance on my screen update in real time. The numbers refreshed and settled. I was now the sole owner of the flagship property and sitting on a massive mountain of cash. The company my father and Vivian loved more than me was now entirely hollowed out. It was a worthless shell. Spencer merger deal was instantly rendered completely void because the operating company no longer had any assets to sell. I closed the laptop and placed it gently back into my leather bag. A deep, satisfying smile spread across my face. I pictured Vivian standing by the ice sculpture drinking champagne and laughing at my expense, completely oblivious to the fact that she was now effectively bankrupt. I pictured my father shaking hands with investors, promising them a future that no longer existed. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking garage. I drove the remaining blocks to my luxury penthouse apartment. The security guard at the front gate waved me through with a polite smile. I parked in my assigned spot and took the private elevator up to the top floor. My phone remained silent in my purse. The financial system usually took about 2 hours to send out the automated catastrophic balance alerts to corporate account holders. That meant they were still at the gala, blindly celebrating their fake victory. I unlocked my front door and stepped into my quiet, beautiful home. I walked straight to the kitchen island and opened a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir. I poured a generous glass and walked over to my floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the incredible Chicago skyline. The trap had been sprung, and I was perfectly ready to watch the dominoes fall. While I stood by my window enjoying the quiet peace of my home, the atmosphere back at the Holloway Hotel was reaching a fever pitch of unearned celebration. The grand ballroom was packed with Chicago elite. Waiters navigated the crowded floor, balancing silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of imported champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. A 12-piece jazz band played smoothly in the corner, providing the perfect soundtrack for what Vivian believed was her absolute triumph. She had successfully completely expelled me from the premises and secured her future. At the center of the room, standing on the first landing of the sweeping marble staircase, was Spencer. He held a glass of champagne high above his head, tapping it with a silver spoon to draw the attention of the wealthy crowd. The gentle clinking sound echoed through the massive space, slowly bringing the conversations to a halt. Gabrielle stood exactly 1 step below him, wearing a dazzling smile, perfectly playing the role of the devoted, adoring wife. David and Vivian stood near the bottom of the stairs, beaming with misplaced pride. "Ladies and gentlemen," Spencer began, his voice projected loudly across the ballroom. He used that smooth, overly confident tone he always adopted when he was trying to sound like the smartest man in the room. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate the 30-year anniversary of the Holloway Hotel. It is a beautiful legacy. But as we all know, in the world of luxury hospitality, relying on the past is simply not enough. You have to evolve, you have to adapt, and sometimes you have to bring in new visionaries to save a sinking ship." He paused for dramatic effect, letting his insult thinly veiled as business acumen wash over my father. David simply smiled and nodded, completely oblivious to the disrespect or too cowardly to care. "That is why I am incredibly proud to announce tonight." Spencer continued, his chest puffed out with sheer arrogance. "My private equity firm has officially agreed in principle to acquire a majority controlling interest in the Holloway Hotel Management Group. We are going to bring this property into the modern era. We are bringing massive capital-aggressive restructuring and a refined vision that will elevate this establishment to compete with the top-tier international brands. To the future of Holloway and the brilliant new management." The crowd erupted into polite applause. Vivian clapped the loudest, her diamond bracelets rattling noisily. She turned to my father and kissed his cheek, whispering something about how they were finally free of financial stress. They truly believed Spencer was handing them a golden ticket. They thought his vulture fund was going to pay off their secret debts and fund their extravagant lifestyle for the next 20 years. They were standing on a stage that was actively collapsing beneath their feet, and they were entirely too busy taking a bow to notice the floorboards giving way. As the jazz band resumed playing and Spencer descended the stairs to accept handshakes and congratulations, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the ballroom swung open violently. It was Thomas, the chief accountant for the Holloway Management Company. Thomas was a meticulous man who usually operated in the shadows, keeping the books balanced and hiding my father's financial incompetence as best as he could. But tonight, Thomas did not look meticulous. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. His face was deathly pale and his usually neat tie was loosened around his neck. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief as he practically sprinted across the ballroom floor. He ignored the wealthy guests he bumped into, completely disregarding the elegant aesthetic Vivian had spent months curating. His eyes were wide with sheer panic, locked entirely on my father. David Thomas gasped, grabbing my father by the arm the moment he reached the bottom of the staircase. "David, we need to talk right now." My father looked startled, trying to gently pry the accountant hand off his expensive tuxedo jacket. "Thomas, what on earth is wrong with you? You are causing a scene in front of the investors. Grab a drink and calm down. We just made the announcement." Vivian stepped forward, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Thomas, you are sweating on my guests. If you have had too much to drink, I highly suggest you leave through the back door before you completely embarrass us." "I am not drunk." "Vivian." Thomas hissed, his voice shaking with a terror that finally made my father pay attention. He leaned in incredibly close to my father, his breathing ragged and uneven. "We need to go to the private office, David. Right this second. The corporate accounts. Something catastrophic just happened." My father's smile finally faltered. "What do you mean, catastrophic? Did the catering check bounce? I told you to move funds from the reserve account." "There is no reserve account," David Thomas whispered, his eyes darting frantically around the room to ensure no investors were eavesdropping. "The money is gone, all of it." Spencer, who had been busy accepting praises from a local politician, noticed the tense huddle and walked over, handing his empty champagne glass to a passing waiter. "Is there a problem here, David?" he asked, using his condescending, authoritative tone. "Because I just pitched $100 million vision to this room, and your accountant looks like he is about to have a heart attack on the dance floor." Thomas looked at Spencer, then back at my father. "David, the bank just sent an automated catastrophic balance alert to my phone. I logged into the central terminal to verify it because I thought it was a massive system error." "It is not an error." Vivian scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes. "What are you rambling about, Thomas? Speak clearly." $23 million. Thomas said, his voice cracking under the weight of the numbers. "Every single cent of liquid cash we had across all operating and reserve accounts was just swept. The accounts are completely empty. We are overdrawn. The management company is effectively bankrupt." The color instantly drained from my father's face. He stumbled backwards slightly, bumping into the heavy marble banister of the staircase. Vivian dropped her expensive designer clutch, the small bag hitting the polished floor with a dull thud. For a few agonizing seconds, the only sound they could hear was the upbeat tempo of the jazz band playing a cheerful tune, completely contrasting the absolute destruction that had just landed directly in their laps. "What do you mean, swept?" Spencer demanded, his face turning an angry shade of red. "Money does not just vanish, Thomas. Who authorized a $23 million wire transfer in the middle of the night?" "Nobody authorized it," Thomas replied, wiping his forehead again, his hands physically shaking. "That is what I am trying to tell you. It was an automated smart contract execution. A penalty clause was triggered." Penalty clause for what? My father croaked out, his hands gripping the marble banister to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. Thomas looked at my father with a mixture of pity and absolute terror. "For the land lease, David. The blind trust that owns the actual real estate. They triggered a default collection for 10 years of unpaid rent. They took everything." While the party continued to rage around them, completely ignorant to the financial slaughter that had just occurred, my family stood frozen in a tight circle of pure panic. The invisible trap I had set years ago had finally snapped shut, catching them all perfectly inside. Thomas pulled his tablet from his leather briefcase and shoved it directly into my father's trembling hands. The screen was glaringly bright in the dim corner of the ballroom. David stared at the digital banking dashboard and felt all the blood rush from his head. The numbers were right there in bold red font. Account frozen due to default judgment. Available balance 0. Pending transactions rejected due to insufficient funds. The entire corporate financial ecosystem had been instantly paralyzed. This is a mistake, Vivian hissed, grabbing the tablet from her husband. Her heavy diamond rings clanked against the glass screen as she aggressively tapped the refresh button. It did not change anything. Banks make mistakes all the time, Thomas. It is a computer glitch. You need to call the private client manager immediately and tell him to fix this before morning. We have vendors to pay for this gala. We have payroll on Friday. You do not just lose $23 million into thin air. It is literally impossible. It is not a glitch, Vivian Thomas said, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. I already tried to call the emergency after hours line. The transfer was not flagged as fraudulent because it was pre-authorized by a smart contract. It was hard-coded into the original land lease agreement from 30 years ago. The blind trust initiated a sweep the exact second the maturity date arrived. They took every liquid asset we had to cover the penalty. My father looked like he was about to pass out. He leaned heavily against the marble wall, loosening his bow tie with shaking fingers. The trust, he mumbled, his eyes wide with absolute horror. Hattie Trust. I stopped making the lease payments 10 years ago because Vivian said we needed the capital for the renovations. Vivian told me they would never collect on a family asset. I thought the trust was just a tax shelter. Vivian's face contorted with ugly rage. Do not you dare blame this on me, David, she snarled, completely forgetting her high society persona. You are the CEO. You signed the financial documents. If some archaic trust fund just robbed us blind, you need to call the police. This is theft. We are the victims here. Call the chief of police right now. He is drinking our champagne at table 4. Spencer let out a loud, arrogant sigh and aggressively adjusted his tuxedo jacket. He looked at my family like they were absolute idiots. Everyone just take a breath and calm down, he commanded, taking the tablet from Vivian. You people always panic over basic administrative errors. This is exactly why you need a guy like me running the show. Banks do not just seize $23 million without a court order. I know the senior vice president of operations at this bank. We play golf at the country club every second Tuesday. I will make one phone call and this will all be reversed by midnight. Thomas shook his head frantically. You do not understand, Spencer. This was an automated smart contract executed by the trust legal team. The money is already gone. It cleared the clearinghouse instantly because it was an internal penalty execution. The bank has no authority to reverse a verified contractual sweep, Spencer sneered, looking down his nose at the terrified accountant. I understand perfectly, Thomas. I understand that you are an incompetent bookkeeper who got scared by an automated email. I am a white man with the best corporate defense lawyers in Chicago on speed dial. My firm deals with multi-billion-dollar mergers every single day. A stupid family trust dispute is amateur hour. My guys will file an emergency injunction, freeze the destination account, and have the bank manager begging for his job by breakfast. We will sue them for emotional distress and breach of fiduciary duty. I am not letting some technical glitch ruin my acquisition. I refuse to let a clerical error derail my profit margins. He pulled his sleek smartphone from his pocket and confidently dialed a number. He walked a few paces away, pacing like a predator who thought he owned the jungle. He began barking orders into the phone, dropping legal buzzwords, and threatening massive lawsuits. He genuinely believed his immense privilege and his loud voice could undo a legally binding contract written by one of the smartest black women in Chicago history. He thought he could bully the system because the system had always worked for him seamlessly. He spoke loudly, making sure my father and Vivian could hear how powerful and connected he was. Gabrielle finally realized the gravity of the situation. Her fake smile vanished completely, leaving behind a look of sheer terror. Dad, what does this mean? She asked, her voice trembling. What about my credit cards? What about the deposit for my trip to Monaco next week? I just ordered a new car yesterday. My father did not answer her. He just stared blankly at the floor. He was finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of his own stupidity. For 10 years, he had lived in a fantasy world entirely funded by money that did not belong to him. He had chosen to listen to Vivian's endless demands for luxury instead of honoring the legal obligations he owed to his own mother legacy. He had traded his birthright for temporary comfort, and now the bill was finally due. Thomas closed his briefcase, looking exhausted and utterly defeated. "I am resigning effective immediately, David," he said quietly. "I cannot go down with this ship. The IRS is going to audit everything when they see a $23 million penalty execution. You are completely on your own. I highly suggest you hire a criminal defense attorney." Thomas turned and walked out the back doors, leaving my family standing alone in their rapidly collapsing nightmare. Vivian started crying genuine tears of panic. Her emerald gown suddenly looked ridiculous and cheap. The string quartet was still playing a lively tune on the other side of the room. The wealthy guests were still drinking the champagne that my father could no longer afford to pay for. Spencer marched back over, snapping his phone shut. His face was entirely red and his arrogant smirk was permanently erased. His breathing was heavy and his eyes darted around nervously. His lawyer had just explained to him what an irrevocable blind trust actually was, and how ironclad the smart contract executed tonight really was. "What did they say?" Vivian pleaded, grabbing his arm, shaking him slightly. "Tell me they reversed it, Spencer. Tell me the money is coming back." "They cannot reverse it." Spencer growled, his voice tight with barely contained fury. He shrugged Vivian's hand off his arm in disgust. "My lawyer checked the public registry while we were on the phone. The trust holds the senior lien on this entire property. Because David defaulted, the trust did not just take the cash. They legally seized the entire building. The management company does not own the hotel anymore. My acquisition is entirely dead. I am not buying a company that has zero assets and negative equity." "Who?" Spencer, my father, asked, his voice barely a whisper. He looked like he aged 20 years in the span of 5 minutes. "Who is the beneficiary of the trust? Who just took our hotel?" Spencer clenched his jaw, his eyes burning with intense hatred. He looked at the heavy glass doors of the lobby where I had walked out less than an hour ago. He swallowed hard before answering the question. "It is Gabrielle," he said, his voice laced with pure venom. "Gabrielle owns everything." The music from the ballroom seemed to completely fade away as the reality of my absolute vengeance finally crashed down on them. The heavy silence that had fallen over my family was suddenly shattered by a sharp buzzing sound. It was my father's phone vibrating frantically in his tuxedo pocket. He flinched as if the device had physically burned him. He pulled it out with trembling hands and stared at the caller ID. It was Mr. Harrison, the senior executive of private wealth management at their primary bank. This was the man who usually sent my father expensive bottles of scotch for Christmas and treated Vivian like royalty whenever she visited the downtown branch. "David, answer it," Vivian demanded, her voice shrill and desperate. "Tell him to fix this right now before the investors realize what is going on. Tell him we are going to pull all our accounts if he does not reverse the transfer immediately." My father swiped the screen and brought the phone to his ear, but his hands were shaking so badly he accidentally hit the speaker button. The crisp, professional voice of Mr. Harrison echoed clearly in the small, panicked circle they had formed near the staircase. "David, we have a massive situation," Mr. Harrison said. His tone was entirely stripped of the warm, sycophantic customer service charm he usually reserved for my family. He sounded incredibly tense and aggressively formal. "I have been trying to reach your chief accountant, but his phone is going straight to voicemail. Thomas just quit." My father mumbled, his voice barely audible over the sound of the jazz band still playing oblivious in the background. "Harrison, listen to me. Someone just hacked our corporate accounts. $23 million was just drained from our reserves. You need to freeze the destination account and reverse the wire transfer right now. We are in the middle of announcing a major acquisition." There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. When Mr. Harrison finally spoke, his words were like heavy stones dropping into a bottomless well. "Nobody hacked your accounts, David," Mr. Harrison said, his voice dropping to a low, serious register. "I am looking directly at the transaction logs from the Central Clearinghouse. This was not an external breach. This was a legally mandated asset sweep executed by a highly encrypted smart contract tied to your primary land lease agreement." "What are you talking about?" My father pleaded, leaning heavily against the marble wall for physical support. I am the CEO of the management company. I did not authorize any smart contract. I did not authorize any transfer. You did not have to authorize it, David, Mr. Harrison explained, sounding increasingly impatient. The authorization was built into the original blind trust document signed by your mother 30 years ago. According to the digital audit trail we just received from the trust legal representatives, your operating company has failed to make a single monthly lease payment for the land under the hotel for exactly 120 months. That is 10 solid years of delinquency, David. Did you really think you could just stop paying rent on a commercial property and no one would ever notice? Vivian snatched the phone from my father's hand, her face twisted in pure outrage. Listen to me very carefully, Harrison, she snarled. We own this hotel. David is the sole heir. That trust is just a family tax shelter. You have no right to let some automated system steal our money. I want that $23 million back in our account by morning, or I swear I will have your job. I will ruin your reputation in this city. Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Harrison replied, his voice turning absolutely ice cold. Let me be perfectly clear with you because you do not seem to grasp the gravity of your legal situation. You do not own the hotel. You own the management company that operates the hotel. The physical building and the land it sits on belong entirely to the blind trust. And because you defaulted on the lease for a decade, the trust invoked a catastrophic penalty clause. They did not just take your cash reserves to cover the back rent and the compounded late fees. They executed a complete asset seizure. Spencer pushed his way into the center of the circle, his face red with anger. He leaned down toward the phone. Harrison, this is Spencer. I am the managing partner of the private equity firm acquiring this property. I have my legal team on standby. You are facilitating a fraudulent transfer, and we are going to hold your institution fully liable. I suggest you manually override this smart contract before I make a phone call to the Federal Reserve Board. The bank manager let out a short, humorless laugh that sounded incredibly loud through the speakerphone. Spencer, I do not care who you know or who you plan to call, Mr. Harrison said sharply. You cannot override an irrevocable trust execution. The Federal Reserve already cleared the funds because the smart contract had direct ledger access. The transaction is completely finalized. And frankly, Spencer, your acquisition deal is completely dead. You cannot buy a management company that no longer has a lease to operate. But the Gala, my father whispered, his eyes wide and vacant as he stared across the room at the wealthy guests drinking his champagne. The vendors. The payroll. Harrison, you have to give me an emergency bridge loan. Just a temporary line of credit to get us through the weekend, so we do not bounce the checks for this party. I have been a loyal client for 20 years. You owe me this. I owe you the truth, David. Mr. Harrison said, his voice softening just a fraction, but remaining entirely unyielding. Your operating company is effectively insolvent. You have zero liquid assets. Your debt-to-income ratio is heavily in the red, and you no longer have a physical property to use as collateral. My compliance department has already flagged your remaining accounts for immediate closure. I cannot give you a bridge loan because you have absolutely no way to pay it back. But what are we supposed to do? Vivian shrieked, tears of genuine panic, finally spilling down her perfectly contoured face. We have hundreds of investors in our ballroom right now. We have politicians here. We cannot just be bankrupt. It does not work like that for people like us. I highly advise you to end your party early, Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Harrison said coldly. And you need to contact the new legal owner of the property immediately. From what the documents indicate, they have full authority to evict your management company from the premises at any given moment. I am truly sorry, David, but your business is over. The line went completely dead. A dull, rhythmic beeping sound echoed from the speakerphone, signaling the end of the call and the end of the Holloway management empire. My father's phone slipped from his numb fingers and clattered onto the hard marble floor, cracking the expensive glass screen. Gabrielle started crying loudly, her hands covering her face, as she realized her luxurious, carefree life was officially gone. Spencer took a huge step back, physically distancing himself from my family, as if their sudden poverty was a highly contagious disease. He looked at my father with absolute disgust. "You lied to me," David Spencer spat out. "You told me the books were clean. You told me the trust was dormant. You are a complete fraud." My father did not argue. He did not try to defend himself. He just slowly slid down the smooth marble wall until he was sitting on the floor of his own magnificent lobby, completely broken. The dazzling chandeliers above them continued to sparkle brightly, casting a harsh light on their absolute ruin. The grand 30-year anniversary gala had officially turned into a beautiful, expensive funeral for their stolen empire. And I was sitting comfortably in my penthouse watching the city lights, knowing that my grandmother's legacy was finally safe in my hands. I poured myself another glass of Pinot Noir and leaned against the cold glass of my penthouse window. I knew exactly what was happening back at the hotel at this very moment. When a catastrophic financial event occurs, the banking automated system does not just freeze the accounts and make a phone call. It immediately dispatches the legal documentation to the registered corporate address to officially serve notice of the seizure. Back at the Holloway Hotel, my father pushed himself off the marble floor. His legs were shaking so violently he could barely stand. Vivian was still sobbing, her makeup completely ruined, but she stopped crying long enough to realize they needed to see the actual paperwork. She grabbed my father by the arm and dragged him away from the stairs. "We need to see the documents, David," she hissed, dragging him toward the private executive offices down the hall. "We need to see exactly who this trust belongs to. If it is a family asset, we can just sue them for mismanagement. We can take it back." Spencer and Gabrielle followed closely behind them, leaving the anniversary party completely unattended. The guests were starting to notice the absence of the hosts, but my family did not care. They rushed down the carpeted hallway and burst into my father-plush corner office. The room was dark except for the green glow of the corporate fax machine and the heavy laser printer sitting on the credenza. The machine was humming loudly, pulling crisp white sheets of paper from the tray. My father practically fell into his leather desk chair, staring at the printer as if it were a bomb about to detonate. The bank had sent over the official notice of default, along with the unsealed trust documents. For 30 years, the identity of the trust beneficiary had been hidden behind layers of non-disclosure agreements and legal firewalls. Grandma Hattie had designed it that way to protect the true heir until they were old enough to claim the empire. Now, because the penalty clause was triggered, the veil of secrecy was officially lifted. Spencer did not wait for my father to collect the pages. He stormed over to the machine and snatched the warm stack of paper the second it finished printing. He was breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with the speed of a desperate man trying to salvage a dying deal. "Give me that," Vivian demanded, reaching for the papers. "Who is it, Spencer? Who is the trustee? Which one of David Greedy cousins is trying to steal our hotel?" Spencer ignored her. He flipped past the first 2 pages of financial disclosures and bank routing numbers. He was looking for the signature page, the final declaration of ownership that would tell him exactly who he needed to destroy in court. His eyes landed on the 3rd page. His aggressive, frantic movements suddenly stopped completely. He froze. "What is it, Spencer?" my father asked, his voice shaking. "Who owns the trust?" Spencer slowly lowered the papers. He looked at my father, then at Vivian. The arrogant white savior complex that had defined his entire personality completely vanished, leaving behind a hollow look of absolute disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Read the name Spencer," Vivian shrieked, slamming her hands on the heavy mahogany desk. "Who owns my hotel?" "It is not your hotel," Vivian Spencer said, his voice eerily quiet. "It never was." He tossed the stack of papers onto the desk. The document slid across the polished wood and came to a stop right in front of my father. The bold black ink was impossible to misread. There at the bottom of the page, under the section labeled Sole Beneficiary and Legal Trustee, was my full name, Gabrielle Elise Holloway. My father stared at the letters as if they were written in a foreign language. He blinked repeatedly, trying to make the words change, but they remained exactly the same. Hattie had bypassed him entirely. She had bypassed his new wife and his golden child. She had left the entire kingdom to the daughter he had spent his life ignoring. No, Vivian gasped, stepping back as if the papers had physically struck her. No, that is impossible. That little ungrateful brat does not have the brains or the money to pull something like this off. It is a forgery. Someone is playing a sick joke on us. It is a certified legal document directly from the central bank, Spencer yelled, finally losing his composure entirely. It is not a forgery, Vivian. Your stepdaughter just outplayed all of us. She is the trustee. She let David default on the lease on purpose. She waited until the exact moment the grace period expired, and then she dropped the hammer. She just wiped out $23 million and seized a $100 million commercial property without stepping foot in a courtroom. Gabrielle sank into one of the leather visitor chairs, her face pale and drawn. But we just kicked her out, she whispered, her voice trembling with the realization of what they had done. I told her her dress looked like garbage. Vivian had security throw her out into the street. We threw out the owner of the building. The silence in the office was deafening. The sheer magnitude of their mistake hung in the air like thick black smoke. They had spent the last 2 hours celebrating a merger that was going to make them incredibly wealthy. They had spent the entire evening mocking me, humiliating me, and treating me like an unwanted peasant invading their royal court. And the entire time I was holding the deed to the castle in my hands. My father buried his face in his hands, letting out a long, broken sob. He finally understood why I had not fought back in the lobby. He understood why I had smiled when I tore up his pathetic $10,000 bribe. I did not need his hush money because I was about to take everything he valued in this world. She knew my father cried into his hands. She stood right there in the lobby and let us humiliate her because she knew she was about to pull the trigger. My mother gave it all to Gabby. Spencer began pacing around the room, furiously running his hands through his hair. "This is a disaster," he muttered. "My investors are out there drinking champagne, waiting for me to sign the final paperwork. How do I explain to them that the company I promised them is literally worthless? How do I explain that I got completely blindsided by a 32-year-old lawyer?" "You need to call her," Vivian said suddenly, her eyes wide and manic. She grabbed my father by the shoulder, shaking him violently. "David, pick up your phone and call her right now. You are her father. You can manipulate her. Tell her you will give her a seat on the board. Tell her you will apologize for the lobby incident. Just get her to reverse the asset seizure before morning." My father looked up at Vivian with tears streaming down his face. "You cannot reverse a bloodless coup, Vivian," he said, his voice completely devoid of hope. "You pushed her away for 17 years. You made me choose between her and this fake life you built. She is not going to answer my calls. She is going to watch us drown." Back in my penthouse, I took another sip of wine, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I placed my empty glass on the counter and walked over to my couch. I picked up my cell phone from the coffee table. As if right on cue, the screen suddenly lit up brightly in the dark room. The caller ID flashed my father's name. I simply smiled, pressed the volume button to mute the ringing, and watched the screen glow as the panic on the other side of the city truly began. My phone continued to flash silently on the coffee table until the screen finally went dark. I knew my father was staring at his own screen in the cramped executive office, realizing that the bridge he had burned years ago was now the only way across the water. Spencer, pacing the floor like a caged animal, finally turned his furious gaze toward Gabrielle. She was still sitting in the leather visitor chair, crying softly into her hands. "You knew about this," he barked, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "You and your mother knew Gabrielle was the trustee, and you hid it from me to secure the merger." Gabrielle looked up, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark streaks. "I did not know, Spencer," she sobbed, holding her hands up defensively. "Nobody knew. We thought the trust was just a dummy corporation Dad set up for tax purposes. I swear I had no idea she owned the land." "Do not play stupid with me," Spencer snapped, closing the distance between them. He pointed a finger inches from her face, his expression twisted with absolute disgust. "I married into this family because you told me you were the heir to a hospitality empire. You told me your sister was completely cut out of the will and that you and your mother controlled everything. I just wasted 2 years of my life and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees structuring a buyout for a company that does not even own its own lobby. You are completely useless to me now. Vivian gasped, stepping in front of her daughter. How dare you speak to my child that way, Spencer? She hissed, her chest heaving. You are her husband. You took vows. You are supposed to protect her. Protect her from what? Vivian Spencer laughed, a cold, bitter sound that lacked any trace of the charm he usually displayed. From poverty. I am a private equity manager, not a charity worker. My firm is going to be a laughingstock by tomorrow morning when the business journals realize I tried to acquire a bankrupt management company. Our marriage was a strategic partnership, and your side just completely defaulted on the terms. He turned his back on his weeping wife and stormed out of the office. My father tried to follow him, pleading with him to stay and figure out a solution, but Spencer violently shoved his arm away. Do not ever contact me again, David Spencer growled before disappearing down the long, carpeted hallway. The three of them were left alone in the dark office, listening to the faint sounds of the jazz band still playing in the ballroom. But the music did not last long. Word of a financial crisis always travels faster than the speed of light in circles of high society. The bank had automatically frozen the corporate accounts, which meant the catering company, the florists, and the event staff received immediate decline notifications on their vendor payment terminals. When my father and Vivian finally gathered the courage to walk back out into the main lobby, they were not greeted by cheers or applause. The ballroom was completely silent. The band had packed up their instruments and were standing near the service exit. The catering manager, a stern woman in a crisp black suit, was standing at the bottom of the marble staircase, holding a portable credit card machine. Mr. Holloway, the manager said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room filled with wealthy socialites. Your corporate card has just been declined for the final gala payment. I need an alternative form of payment immediately, or my staff will begin clearing the tables right now. Whispers erupted among the elite crowd. Politicians and investors exchanged knowing glances. Spencer was already standing near the main exit with his legal team instructing them in loud voices to draft an emergency press release completely distancing his fund from the Holloway family. He wanted everyone in the room to know he was a victim of their fraud. I am so sorry, there must be a misunderstanding, my father stammered, patting his empty tuxedo pockets nervously. Vivian, give her your personal black card just to hold the charge until tomorrow morning. Vivian's hands were shaking as she pulled the heavy metal card from her designer clutch and handed it to the manager. The woman inserted the chip. A few seconds later, the machine beeped, a harsh red light flashing on the small digital screen. Declined, the manager said, her tone dropping all pretense of customer service politeness. The whispers in the room turned into loud murmuring. The facade of their immense wealth was completely shattered. Vivian's face turned an unnatural shade of red as she desperately tried to snatch the card back from the manager. Try it again, she demanded. I have a $200,000 limit on that card. You are doing it wrong. Not anymore, Mrs. Holloway, the manager replied, pulling the machine away and crossing her arms. The primary account holder was your husband, corporate entity. When the bank froze the business accounts, they froze all affiliated personal lines of credit to prevent asset flight. You have absolutely zero available funds. The humiliation was absolute. The very people Vivian had spent decades trying to impress, the same people she had kicked me out to appease, were now watching her public destruction. A few guests began walking toward the coat check, whispering behind their hands. Investors who had just congratulated my father an hour ago were actively avoiding eye contact and heading straight for the valet parking. This is your fault! David, Vivian screamed, suddenly turning on my father in front of everyone. Her voice cracked with sheer panic and rage. You told me the trust was handled. You told me she could never touch us. You ruined my life. I ruined your life, my father yelled back, finally snapping under the immense pressure. You spent every single dime this company made on your ridiculous vanity projects and your designer clothes. You are the reason we could not pay the lease. You drained the accounts dry and told me to ignore my own mother's will. Gabrielle ran out of the office and stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down at the total disaster. She saw Spencer walking out the front doors. "Spencer," she called out, her voice desperate and pleading. "Please do not leave me here. We can fix this." Spencer did not even turn around. He pushed through the heavy glass doors and disappeared into the cold Chicago night, abandoning her the exact same way they had all tried to abandon me. My father collapsed onto the bottom step of the staircase, putting his head between his knees as he realized his empire was gone. Vivian stood frozen in her expensive emerald gown, entirely stripped of her power and prestige, while the guests continued to filter out of the ballroom. They were leaving my family alone in the cold, empty shell of a hotel they no longer owned. And as the final guest departed, the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom swung shut, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of their own arrogance. I walked over to the oversized velvet sofa in the center of my living room and sank into the plush cushions. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. The city looked like a glittering ocean of diamonds, scattered across the dark velvet night. For years I had looked out at these very same lights and felt a lingering sense of isolation. I had built a successful life, a beautiful home, and a formidable career, but the shadow of my family had always loomed somewhere in the distance. Tonight, however, the skyline looked entirely different. It looked like absolute freedom. My cell phone lay on the polished marble coffee table. It was completely silent because I had muted the ringer, but the screen was a relentless strobe light of desperation. It lit up, flashed wildly, went dark for exactly 2 seconds, and then lit up all over again. I picked it up and casually swiped down to view my notifications. There were 79 missed calls. 79 desperate attempts to reach the daughter they had collectively pretended did not exist for the past 17 years. The breakdown of the missed calls was highly predictable and deeply satisfying. There were 30 calls from my father. I could almost picture him pacing the cold marble floor of his empty hotel lobby, loosening his expensive tie and sweating through his custom shirt. His calls were likely frantic attempts to play the family card to remind me that we shared the same blood and that I owed him a conversation. He had never once called me when I graduated law school or when I bought this penthouse, but now that his bank accounts were frozen suddenly, I was the most important person in his entire world. Then there were 25 calls from Vivian. Her numbers came through rapid fire back to back. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was demanding that my father call me, and when he failed, she took matters into her own hands. I could imagine her perfectly manicured nails tapping aggressively against her phone screen, her face red with pure aristocratic rage. She probably wanted to scream at me, threaten me with a lawsuit, and demand her hotel back, as if I were a misbehaving child who had stolen her favorite toy. She was entirely incapable of understanding that she had no power left. Her calls were not requests, they were the dying gasps of a dictator who had just been overthrown. Gabrielle had called 15 times. Her calls started coming in right after Spencer had likely abandoned her at the hotel. Gabrielle had never called me a single time in her entire adult life, unless she needed a legal favor or someone to co-sign a luxury apartment lease, which I always refused. Her calls were undoubtedly fueled by sheer terror. She had no job skills, no personal savings, and a husband who only valued her for her inherited wealth. Now that the wealth was gone, she was staring directly into the abyss of a normal working-class life, and it terrified her more than death itself. Finally, there were 9 calls from unknown numbers. I smiled, realizing these were most likely from Spencer. He was probably borrowing phones from the hotel valet or the remaining event staff trying to bypass my blocked contacts list. Spencer was a man who believed every single problem could be solved with the right negotiation and enough aggressive corporate posturing. He wanted to get me on the line so he could explain the situation, offer me a terrible deal, and try to salvage his doomed acquisition. He truly believed he could talk his way out of an ironclad smart contract. It was almost comical. I placed the phone back down on the cold marble table and took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine. I let the rich, dark flavor coat my tongue. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. For years I had watched them celebrate their milestones without me. I had watched them spend my grandmother hard-earned money on frivolous luxury while treating me like an embarrassing secret. They had weaponized their silence against me, using it to isolate me and make me feel entirely worthless. Now I was taking their weapon and using it against them. The power of silence is absolute. When you do not answer the phone, you force your enemies to sit alone with their own catastrophic thoughts. You deny them the opportunity to argue, to manipulate, or to play the victim. Every time the phone rang and went to voicemail, their panic multiplied. They were trapped in an echo chamber of their own making, slowly realizing that the girl they had thrown away was now the architect of their complete destruction. I thought about Grandma Hattie. I remembered sitting with her on the front porch of her old house when I was a little girl before the massive hotels and the corporate holding companies existed. She used to hold my hand and tell me that wealth was not about the clothes you wore or the cars you drove. She said true wealth was having the discipline to wait for the right moment to strike. She knew my father was weak. She knew Vivian was a parasite. And she knew I was the only one who had the quiet strength to eventually clean house. I raised my wine glass toward the ceiling, offering a silent toast to the brilliant woman who had engineered this beautiful revenge from beyond the grave. "We did it, Grandma," I whispered into the quiet room. The screen on my phone finally stopped flashing. The barrage of calls had temporarily ceased, but I knew this was not the end. The silence was just the calm before the final storm. People like Vivian and Spencer do not just accept defeat and walk away quietly. They were desperate, entitled, and backed into a corner. I knew they would not settle for leaving voicemails. They needed to see me face to face. They needed to try and bully me in person just like they had always done. I stood up from the sofa and walked into my master bathroom. I splashed cold water on my face and looked at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were clear and my posture was perfectly straight. I changed out of the vintage velvet dress and put on a comfortable pair of silk lounge pants and a cashmere sweater. I wanted to be perfectly relaxed for the final act of this tragedy. I walked back into the living room and checked the digital clock on the wall. It was approaching midnight. The city below was starting to quiet down, but my night was far from over. I knew they were coming. I could feel the desperate energy moving across the city, heading straight for my front door. I simply sat back down, poured myself one final glass of wine, and waited patiently for the inevitable knock. I took a slow sip of my wine and looked at the dark screen of my phone. The relentless barrage of incoming calls had finally stopped, but the voicemail icon was now glowing with a bright red notification indicating my inbox was completely full. I reached over and tapped the screen, opening the voicemail box. I pressed the speaker icon and set the device back down on the cold marble of the coffee table. I wanted their voices to fill my quiet living room. I wanted to hear the exact sound of their empire crumbling brick by beautiful brick. The automated system announced the first message. It was recorded just a few minutes after the bank fax had printed in my father's office. A soft beep echoed in the room, followed immediately by the sharp, aggressive tone of my stepmother. "Gabrielle, you listen to me right now," Vivian hissed, her voice echoing slightly, suggesting she was still pacing the corporate office. "I do not know what kind of illegal computer trick you pulled, but you are going to federal prison. You do not own this hotel. You are going to call the bank and reverse this massive theft immediately. We are calling the police and we are pressing charges. You are a complete disgrace to this family." I smiled, taking another sip of the rich red wine. She was still operating under the delusion of power. She still thought she could command me like a disobedient child. I let the automated system skip to her fifth message, recorded perhaps 20 minutes later. "Gabby, pick up the phone." Vivian's voice was louder now, laced with a frantic, breathless quality. "David is talking to the legal team right now. They are going to completely destroy you in court. You have absolutely no right to that trust. I raised you when your mother died. I gave you a roof over your head. You owe us everything. You are nothing without the Holloway name. Turn the money back over before I ruin your pathetic little life." The arrogance was staggering, but I knew it was fragile. I let the voicemails continue to play. By the 15th message, the tone shifted dramatically. The reality of her frozen bank accounts and the empty ballroom had clearly set in. "Gabrielle, please," Vivian's voice came through the speaker, completely broken and barely recognizable. I could hear the faint sound of her crying. She was sobbing hysterically, taking ragged, uneven breaths. The caterers took everything. The guests are all gone. My credit cards are declining, and we do not even have money for a private car to get home. Please, Gabby. I am so sorry for what I said in the lobby. I was just stressed about the party. I will apologize in public. I will get on my knees and apologize in front of everyone. Just give us the hotel back. I have nothing else. Please do not leave me with nothing. I felt absolutely no pity for her. Her tears were not born of genuine remorse but of sudden, terrifying poverty. I reached out and tapped the screen, moving to the next set of messages. A new beep sounded. It was my father. His voice sounded ancient, tired, and utterly defeated. "Gabby, it is, Dad," he mumbled, sounding as if he were hiding in a closet. "Please pick up the phone, sweetheart. We need to act like a family and figure this out together. I know I made mistakes. I know Vivian can be difficult and I should have defended you tonight. But taking $23 million is just too much. You are completely destroying my life. Let us just sit down at the boardroom table tomorrow morning and negotiate a fair percentage for you. I can put you on the board of directors. We can share the legacy." I rolled my eyes at his pathetic attempt to bargain. He was offering me a seat at a table that I now owned entirely. He was trying to give me a small slice of my own pie. The next message from him was even more desperate. "Gabby, they locked us out of the corporate accounts," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I cannot even buy gas to drive my car out of the parking garage. Please do not do this to your own father. I gave you life. Your grandmother Hattie never would have wanted to see our family torn apart like this. She wanted us to build wealth together." He was entirely wrong about Grandma Hattie. She had anticipated this exact scenario. She had built the trap specifically because she knew he would eventually sell his soul to keep up appearances. The system beeped again, moving on to the final batch of messages. It was Spencer. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, suddenly very interested in hearing how the arrogant white savior was handling his absolute humiliation. "Gabrielle, this is Spencer." His voice boomed through the speaker, attempting to sound like an authoritative alpha male. "Listen, I am going to overlook the emotional stunt you just pulled because I respect a good aggressive business move. You made your point. But you are playing a very dangerous game with high-level corporate finance right now. My investors are getting anxious. Pick up the phone and let us talk equity. I can make you a senior partner in my private equity firm. We can push David and Vivian out entirely and run this property together. Call me back immediately." He was actually trying to betray my father and align himself with me. It was the ultimate display of corporate greed. But his fake confidence did not last. By his fourth voicemail, the cracks in his armor were wide open. "Gabrielle, you need to call me back right now," Spencer yelled, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and sheer terror. "Gabrielle is having a massive panic attack in the lobby, and my senior partners are threatening to pull my funding entirely. You just voided a $100 million merger. Do you understand the massive liability you just took on? I have people breathing down my neck for their money. Let us make a deal before the market opens tomorrow. I am begging you to be reasonable. I cannot go bankrupt over this." The voicemails finally stopped. The automated voice announced that there were no more messages. The living room returned to a heavy, peaceful silence. I sat back on the velvet sofa and let out a long breath. They had tried threats, they had tried bargaining, they had tried begging, but none of it mattered. I had not answered a single call because my silence was the most powerful response I could possibly give them. I knew exactly what they were going to do next. When wealthy, entitled people realize they cannot manipulate you over the phone, they decide to confront you in person. They think their physical presence will somehow intimidate you into submission. I looked at the heavy oak door of my penthouse. It was past midnight. The city was asleep, but my family was wide awake and desperate. I finished the last drop of my wine and stood up. I walked over to the digital intercom panel on the wall and waited for the inevitable sound of the buzzer. The sharp buzz of the intercom shattered the quiet ambiance of my living room. I did not flinch. I had been standing near the wall panel for the last 10 minutes waiting for that exact sound. I pressed the silver button to connect the line, and the voice of Derek, the night concierge at the front desk, filled the room. "Ms. Holloway." Derek began, his voice carrying a mixture of professional restraint and undeniable concern. I am so sorry to disturb you at this hour, but there is a group of people down here demanding to see you. They are causing quite a disturbance in the main lobby. I leaned casually against the wall, running a hand over the smooth silk of my lounge pants. Who exactly is causing a disturbance, Derek? Well, one of the gentlemen claims to be your father, Derek explained, lowering his voice as if he were trying to hide the phone from them. He is accompanied by two women in evening gowns and another gentleman in a tuxedo. They look like they just came from a formal event, but they are being highly aggressive. The older woman is currently yelling at my security staff, threatening to buy the building and have us all fired if we do not grant them immediate access to the penthouse elevators. I was just about to call the police to have them escorted off the property, but the older gentleman showed me his identification and said it was an absolute family emergency. I let out a soft laugh. The irony was incredibly delicious. Just a few hours ago, Vivian was threatening to fire the hotel security for not throwing me out fast enough. Now she was at the mercy of my building security, trying to use her imaginary wealth to bully her way through the front door. Do not call the police, Derek, I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and measured. They are indeed my family, or at least they used to be. Should I send them away, Ms. Holloway? Derek asked, clearly relieved that he did not have to deal with a physical altercation in his pristine marble lobby. I can tell them you are asleep and cannot be disturbed. We have strict protocols against unannounced late-night visitors. No, I replied, a cold smile playing on my lips. Send them up, Derek. Give them full access to the private elevator. But I want you to do me a favor. Send two of your armed guards up through the service elevator right behind them. Have them wait quietly in the hallway outside my door just in case my guests forget their manners. Understood, Ms. Holloway. Derek said, his tone shifting to absolute professionalism. They are on their way up now. I released the intercom button and stepped back into the center of my living room. My penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the building. The private elevator opened directly into my personal foyer, which was separated from the main living area by a set of heavy double doors. I walked over to the smart home control panel and adjusted the lighting. I turned the ambient lights down slightly, leaving the dramatic spotlights focused on the expensive modern art hanging on my walls. I wanted them to step out of that elevator and be immediately overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the wealth I had built entirely without their help. I stood perfectly still, watching the digital display above the foyer doors. The red numbers slowly ticked upward as the elevator climbed the 50 stories from the ground floor. 41, 42, 43. I thought about the last time we were all in an elevator together. I was 18 years old, and my father was taking us to a celebratory dinner because Gabrielle had just been accepted into a prestigious private middle school. I had just received my acceptance letter to a top-tier university on a full academic scholarship, but nobody mentioned it. Vivian had spent the entire ride adjusting Gabrielle's hair and telling her how she was destined for greatness, while my father proudly held her hand. I had stood silently in the back corner holding my cheap backpack, feeling entirely invisible. Tonight they were riding up to my floor, and there was absolutely no way they could ignore me now. 47, 48, 49. The elevator arrived with a soft, melodious chime. The heavy steel doors slid open with a quiet, mechanical hum. I remained in the living room, allowing them to step into the foyer first. I wanted to observe them in their natural state of panic before I engaged. Through the glass panes of the double doors, I watched them stumble out of the elevator. They looked like the survivors of a luxurious shipwreck. The transformation from the arrogant elites in the hotel lobby to the desperate intruders in my foyer was absolutely staggering. My father stepped out first. He looked completely defeated, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his ruined tuxedo jacket. He was breathing heavily, as if the elevator ride itself had physically exhausted him. Vivian followed closely behind him. Her emerald green gown, which had looked so immaculate hours ago, was now wrinkled and slightly torn at the hem. Her perfect updo had completely unraveled, leaving strands of blonde hair clinging to her tear-stained face. She looked manic, her eyes darting wildly around the sleek minimalist foyer, taking in the expensive finishes and the undeniable proof of my success. Brielle walked out next, clutching her designer bag to her chest like a life preserver. She was shaking visibly, her bare shoulders shivering in the air conditioning. She looked incredibly small, entirely stripped of the unearned confidence she usually paraded around. And finally, Spencer stepped out. He was the only one still trying to maintain a facade of control. He angrily adjusted his bow tie and stood tall, scanning the area with the aggressive posture of a man preparing for a hostile corporate takeover. He had clearly forced his way into the family car, refusing to be left behind because he still believed he could salvage his doomed acquisition by intimidating me in person. They stood awkwardly in the foyer, realizing the double doors were locked. Vivian grabbed the brass handle and rattled it furiously, her heavy diamond rings clanking against the metal. Gabrielle, she shrieked, her voice muffled through the thick glass. "Open this door right now. I know you are in there." I took a deep, steadying breath. This was it. The moment I had planned for, envisioned, and meticulously orchestrated for the past decade was finally here. They were standing on my threshold, stripped of their power and their money, begging for an audience with the daughter they had discarded. I walked slowly toward the double doors, my silk lounge pants swishing quietly against the hardwood floor. I did not rush. I let them watch me approach, projecting absolute calm and unbothered authority. When I reached the doors, I reached out and turned the heavy deadbolt. The lock clicked open with a loud, definitive sound, echoing in the quiet space. I grabbed the brass handles and pulled both doors open, stepping back to welcome my enemies into my domain. The midnight confrontation had officially begun. Vivian did not even hesitate. The second the heavy double doors swung fully open, she pushed past my father and charged directly at me. Her face was twisted into an ugly mask of pure hatred. She raised her hands, her heavy diamond rings aiming straight for my face. "You little thief!" she screamed, her voice echoing harshly against the high ceilings of my foyer. "I am going to tear you apart!" I did not move a single muscle. I did not blink. I knew exactly what was about to happen. Before Vivian could even cross the threshold, two massive figures stepped seamlessly out of the shadows of the service hallway. Derek had followed my instructions perfectly. The two armed security guards were built like professional linebackers dressed in immaculate black suits. They moved with terrifying speed and precision. The lead guard stepped directly in front of me, planting his feet and raising a single massive hand. He caught Vivian by the shoulder of her ruined emerald gown, completely halting her momentum in an instant. Vivian hit the guard's solid frame and bounced backward as if she had just run into a concrete pillar. She stumbled on her expensive high heels, her arms flailing wildly before my father managed to catch her by the waist to keep her from falling onto the polished hardwood floor. The second guard stepped up beside the first, resting his hand casually near the tactical equipment on his belt. His posture communicated absolute, unquestionable authority. "Ma'am, you need to step back immediately," the lead guard said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that completely dominated the room. "If you attempt to physically assault a resident on this property again, we will place you under immediate citizen's arrest and hold you for the Chicago Police Department." Vivian was panting heavily, her chest heaving as she stared up at the two human walls standing between us. The sheer physical reality of her absolute powerlessness finally seemed to register in her frantic brain. She was no longer in the grand lobby of her hotel, where she could snap her fingers and make unwanted people disappear. She was in my domain, and I controlled every single variable. Brielle let out a small, terrified whimper and pressed her back against the elevator doors, clutching her designer bag, as if it could somehow protect her from the consequences of her own actions. I stepped slightly to the side, moving just enough so Vivian had a perfectly clear view of my calm, unbothered expression. "I did not steal anything, Vivian," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly level. "Stealing implies taking something that does not legally belong to you. I simply claimed the inheritance that Grandma Hattie left specifically for me. I reached out and executed a contract that was drafted before I even graduated high school." "You are a complete liar," Vivian spat, struggling weakly against my father's grip. "Hattie loved David. He was her only son. She would never leave the core asset of the entire hospitality empire to a bitter little girl. The trust was meant to protect the family from outside corporate taxes, not to give you the power to ruin us. She left it to the only deserving heir. I corrected her, my tone dropping a few degrees colder. She left it to the only person in this family who actually respected her legacy, instead of using it as a personal ATM machine. Hattie knew exactly who you were, Vivian. She saw right through your fake smiles and your pathetic attempts to play the wealthy matriarch. She knew you were a parasite who would eventually bleed this family completely dry just to fund your ridiculous vanity projects and your desperate need for high society validation. And she knew my father was entirely too weak to ever stop you. So she built an invisible, impenetrable vault around the most valuable asset we owned, and she handed me the only key. My father slowly let go of Vivian and took a hesitant step forward. He looked incredibly small, standing there in his wrinkled tuxedo. Gabby, please listen to reason, he begged, his voice trembling. You cannot honestly believe Hattie wanted to see me destroyed. I am her son. I worked alongside her for years to build the brand. She would never want you to leave me completely bankrupt and humiliated in front of the entire city. I looked at my father, feeling a brief familiar twinge of disappointment before my emotional armor hardened once again. You destroyed yourself, Dad, I said, looking directly into his exhausted eyes. Hattie gave you the operating company. She gave you a massive head start and a highly profitable business model. All you had to do was run the hotel properly and pay the lease to the trust. But you chose to stop paying. You chose to violate the contract because Vivian wanted another vacation home, and Brielle needed a new sports car every single year. You spent 10 years living in a fantasy world built entirely on stolen time and unpaid rent. The penalty clause was activated because of your profound negligence, not my malice. But $23 million, Gabby, he pleaded, holding his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. You swept every single account. We cannot make payroll tomorrow. Hundreds of innocent employees are going to lose their jobs because you wanted to prove a point. You are hurting innocent people. Do not try to manipulate me by hiding behind the hotel staff, Dad, I replied sharply, cutting off his pathetic attempt at guilt. The employees will be perfectly fine. As the new legal owner of the property, I have already instructed my legal team to set up an emergency payroll distribution fund. I am absorbing the entire staff under my new management structure. The only people losing their jobs tomorrow morning are you, Vivian, and Brielle. Brielle let out a loud, dramatic sob at the mention of her name. But I am the director of public relations, she cried, stepping forward from the elevator doors. You cannot just fire me, Gabby. I have a contract. My entire life is tied to that hotel. You do not have a contract, Brielle, I said, turning my cold gaze toward her. You have a fake title that Dad invented so you could justify swiping a corporate credit card at luxury boutiques on Oak Street. You have absolutely no functional role in the actual operations of the business. You are a massive financial liability, and as of midnight tonight, your position has been entirely eliminated. I suggest you start updating your resume. Spencer, who had been standing silently near the back of the group, finally pushed his way to the front. He adjusted his suit jacket, trying to project the image of a seasoned negotiator stepping in to handle an emotional family dispute. He still foolishly believed he was the smartest person in the room. All right, Gabrielle, let us drop the aggressive posturing, Spencer said, adopting a smooth, condescending tone. You played a brilliant hand. I will give you full credit for the ambush. It was ruthless and highly effective. But now it is time to talk real business. You are a corporate lawyer, not a hospitality executive. You do not know how to run a $100 million flagship hotel on your own. You need an experienced partner to help you transition the brand and manage the physical assets. I crossed my arms and tilted my head, observing him like a scientist studying a particularly predictable insect. And I suppose you are offering to be that partner, Spencer, I asked, my voice entirely devoid of any genuine curiosity. Exactly, he nodded, stepping slightly closer but keeping a safe distance from the two massive security guards. My private equity fund is still highly liquid. I can bring in immediate working capital to stabilize the transition. We form a new joint venture. You keep the land and the building, and my firm takes over the daily management operations. We push David and Vivian out completely just like you want. We rebrand the hotel, and we both walk away incredibly wealthy. It is the only logical move here, Gabrielle. I let out a slow, deliberate breath. It was finally time to drop the ultimate payload on Spencer. He thought he was untouchable. He thought his corporate maneuvering and his absolute arrogance shielded him from the consequences of his own greed. He was about to find out exactly how deep my investigation into this family had actually gone. I listened to Spencer outline his brilliant joint venture proposal. He used all his favorite corporate buzzwords talking about synergy and brand repositioning and asset optimization. He genuinely believed that because I was a woman, and because he was a seasoned private equity manager, I would naturally bow to his superior intellect. He thought I was just an angry daughter throwing a temper tantrum who secretly desperately needed a man to come in and fix the complicated math. He stood there in my private foyer, adjusting his expensive cufflinks, acting as if he held all the cards when he actually had absolutely nothing. I let him finish his entire pitch. I let the silence hang in the foyer for a few seconds, letting his arrogance completely fill the room. I wanted him to feel powerful just for one more fleeting moment. Then I turned around and walked over to the sleek console table resting against the wall. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I turned back around and walked right up to the invisible line the security guards had drawn. "You want to talk about real business, Spencer?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Let us talk about real business. Let us talk about a holding company called Blue Horizon Investments." The color instantly drained from Spencer's face. His confident posture completely collapsed. He looked as if I had just punched him directly in the stomach. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic stuttering sound came out. The arrogant white savior facade cracked and shattered into a million tiny pieces right in front of my eyes. I opened the folder and pulled out a stack of financial records, tossing them carelessly onto the floor at his feet. Blue Horizon is a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. I continued, making sure my father and Vivian were listening closely. It is completely anonymous on paper, but when you spend a decade studying trust law, you learn exactly how to trace offshore wire transfers. You have been funneling money out of the Holloway Hotel reserve accounts for the last 2 years, Spencer. You disguised them as consulting fees and high-end vendor payouts for renovations that never actually happened. Spencer took a step back, his eyes darting wildly toward the elevator. "That is a lie," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You are fabricating documents. You are just trying to ruin my reputation because you hate me." "I am not fabricating anything," I said, stepping closer. "I have the digital footprints, the routing numbers, and the signature authorizations. You stole over $5 million from my father's company. You purposely bled the hotel dry so David would be forced into a panic sale. You created the exact financial crisis you claimed you were going to save them from. You needed the company to be desperate so your fund could buy it for pennies on the dollar. You are not a white knight, Spencer. You are a common thief wearing a cheap tuxedo." My father let out a choked gasp, staring down at the papers scattered on the hardwood floor. He looked at Spencer with a mixture of absolute betrayal and profound stupidity. "You stole from me," David asked, his voice breaking. "You sat at my dinner table every Sunday, and you stole from my family. You told me those consulting fees were mandatory for the merger preparation." Brielle covered her mouth with trembling hands, staring at her husband as if he were a complete stranger. "Spencer." "Tell me she is lying," Brielle cried, her voice echoing loudly in the foyer. "Tell me you did not steal from Dad. Tell me we actually have money." Spencer did not look at her. He did not look at my father or Vivian. He was staring directly at the security guards, calculating his chances of escaping the building before I called the federal authorities. His entire private equity career was completely over. If his investors found out he was embezzling funds from his own father-in-law, he would not just lose his firm, he would go to federal prison. He was a cornered animal, realizing the trap had closed permanently. "You cannot prove any of this," Spencer muttered, but the absolute panic in his eyes confirmed every single word I had said. You do not have access to my private banking records. I already have the proof, Spencer, I replied, offering him a cold, ruthless smile. I sent the entire dossier to the Securities and Exchange Commission 20 minutes before you arrived at my door. I also sent a copy to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They take wire fraud and corporate embezzlement very seriously. I am sure they will be reaching out to you shortly to discuss your impressive synergy and asset optimization. Vivian let out a horrified shriek, completely forgetting her own financial ruin for a brief second. She turned on Spencer, slapping him across the chest with her bare hands. "You ruined us!" she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "You told us you were going to make us rich, and you were robbing us the entire time. You manipulative little snake! I gave you my daughter." Spencer shoved her away violently, his face twisted in pure rage. "Get off me," he snarled. "You people are pathetic. You deserve to lose this hotel. You are all completely incompetent and greedy. It was incredibly easy to steal from you because you never even checked the ledgers. You just wanted the cash to keep flowing." "That is enough," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos like a sharp blade. The two security guards immediately stepped forward, physically separating Spencer from my family, pushing him back toward the open elevator doors. "My foyer is not a public fighting ring," I said, gesturing toward the hallway. "You came here tonight to demand your hotel back. You came here to threaten me and intimidate me into giving up my rightful inheritance. But you have absolutely nothing left to bargain with. The hotel is mine, the land is mine, and the $23 million is legally mine. You have entirely overstayed your welcome." My father looked at me, his eyes filled with genuine tears. He looked incredibly old and completely defeated. "What are we supposed to do, Gabby?" he whispered. "Where are we supposed to go tonight? We do not have any money left." "That is no longer my concern, Dad," I said, feeling the final absolute release of my familial obligation. "You chose Vivian. You chose Brielle. You chose Spencer. You built your entire life around their lies and their greed. You watched them humiliate me for years, and you did absolutely nothing. Now you can figure out how to survive with them." I looked at the lead security guard and gave him a brief nod. "Escort them out of the building, Derek," I said. "Make sure they do not cause any trouble in the main lobby. If they resist, call the police immediately." "Yes, Miss Holloway," the guard replied, stepping toward my family and using his massive frame to herd them backward. "Time to go, folks," he said, his voice leaving absolutely no room for argument. "Step into the elevator right now." Vivian opened her mouth to scream another insult, but the second guard rested his hand firmly on his duty belt, and she instantly clamped her mouth shut. Brielle was sobbing hysterically, clinging to the brass handrail inside the elevator car, completely traumatized by her sudden poverty. My father looked completely hollowed out, a broken man who had just watched his entire legacy evaporate into thin air. Spencer was the last to step inside his face, pale and sweating, his eyes locked firmly on the floor. I stood in the doorway watching them huddle together in the small confined space. They looked exactly like what they truly were, a group of toxic, greedy individuals who had finally been held completely accountable for their actions. They had nothing left but each other, and I knew they would spend the rest of their lives tearing each other apart. "Oh, and one more thing," I said just as the heavy steel doors began to close. "We are holding an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning at 8:00 sharp in the main executive conference room. I expect all of you to be there to formally surrender the corporate assets and sign the transition papers." I offered them one final victorious smile. "Do not be late." The elevator doors slid shut completely, cutting off their terrified faces and their pathetic sobbing. The digital numbers above the door began to tick downward, taking my toxic family far away from my peaceful sanctuary. 49, 48, 47. I was completely alone again, but the silence in my penthouse no longer felt isolating. It felt incredibly warm and deeply satisfying. I walked over to the foyer console table, closed the top drawer, and headed back into my living room. The night was finally over, and tomorrow I was going to completely clean house. I woke up at 6:00 the next morning feeling a profound sense of absolute clarity. The heavy emotional exhaustion that had followed me for 17 years was completely gone. I showered and dressed with meticulous care, choosing a tailored crimson power suit that projected undeniable authority. I paired it with my mother vintage gold necklace. It was a subtle reminder of the bloodline that truly built the empire I was about to officially reclaim. I drank a single cup of black coffee, looked out over the morning sun reflecting off Lake Michigan, and headed down to my car. The drive to the downtown financial district was incredibly peaceful. When I pulled up to the front entrance of the Holloway Hotel, the atmosphere was entirely different from the night before. The red carpet was gone. The flashing cameras were gone. The valet took my keys with a nervous, respectful nod. He had clearly heard the rumors swirling among the staff about the massive change in ownership. I walked through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped into the grand marble lobby. It was quiet. The catering staff was quietly breaking down the remaining tables from the disastrous anniversary gala. Waiting for me near the private executive elevators were 4 individuals dressed in sharp, dark suits. 2 of them wore dark windbreakers, with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across the back. The other 2 were senior investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission. I had been coordinating with them since the early hours of the morning, providing them with the digital access codes to the offshore financial records I had uncovered. "Good morning, Ms. Holloway," the lead federal agent said, offering a professional handshake. "I am Special Agent Carter. We have reviewed the dossier you transmitted. The evidence of offshore embezzlement and wire fraud is incredibly comprehensive. We are fully prepared to proceed with the arrest and asset freezing protocols." "Thank you, Agent Carter," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "They are waiting for us on the top floor." We stepped into the elevator together. The ride up to the executive boardroom was silent, but the air was thick with anticipation. When the doors slid open on the 50th floor, I walked confidently down the plush, carpeted hallway. The walls were lined with framed photographs of my father, shaking hands with politicians and cutting grand opening ribbons. By the end of the day, I was going to have every single one of those pictures taken down and replaced with portraits of Grandma Hattie. The executive boardroom was a massive space entirely enclosed in soundproof glass walls, offering a panoramic view of the city. I could see my family sitting around the heavy mahogany conference table before I even opened the door. They looked absolutely pathetic. They were still wearing the wrinkled formal clothes from the night before. They had clearly not slept a single wink. My father had his head resting on his arms, staring blankly at the polished wood. Vivian was holding a cold cup of coffee, her face haggard and stripped of all her usual high society arrogance. Brielle was picking nervously at her cuticles, her eyes red and swollen from crying all night. And Spencer was sitting at the far end of the table, furiously typing on his phone, trying desperately to find a legal loophole that simply did not exist. I turned the heavy brass handle and pushed the glass door open. The soft click of the latch echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. All 4 of their heads snapped up instantly. When they saw me walk into the room, their expressions shifted from exhaustion to nervous anticipation. But when they saw the 4 federal agents walk in right behind me, the nervous anticipation immediately morphed into sheer unadulterated terror. My father bolted upright, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Gabby, what is going on?" he stammered, his eyes darting frantically between the FBI windbreakers and the grim faces of the SEC investigators. "Why are the authorities here? We are supposed to be having a private family board meeting." "There is no family board meeting, Dad," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the massive room. I walked over to the head of the table, the seat my father had occupied for decades, and set my leather briefcase down with a heavy thud. "You do not have a board of directors anymore because your company no longer holds any assets. I did not bring you here to negotiate. I brought you here to witness the legal consequences of your own absolute greed." Spencer dropped his phone on the table. He stood up, his face turning the color of chalk. He tried to puff out his chest and project his usual arrogant white male authority, but his knees were visibly shaking. "You cannot do this, Gabrielle," he said, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. "I am a licensed private equity manager. You have no legal jurisdiction to bring federal agents into a private corporate dispute." "I did not bring them here for a corporate dispute, Spencer," I replied calmly, opening my briefcase. I pulled out the original printed dossier containing the Blue Horizon Investments bank records and slid it across the long mahogany table directly into the hands of Special Agent Carter. I brought them here to report a federal crime. Agent Carter opened the folder and briefly scanned the top document before looking directly at Spencer. Spencer, you are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the deliberate manipulation of financial securities, Agent Carter said, his voice a deep booming command that completely dominated the room. Step away from the table and place your hands behind your back immediately. Spencer completely lost his mind. He looked around the glass boardroom like a trapped rat looking for an impossible exit. This is a complete setup, he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. She fabricated those documents. I was just doing aggressive financial restructuring. You cannot arrest me on her word. I demand to call my lawyers right now. I know the mayor. I know the federal judges in this district. Two FBI agents quickly moved around the table, completely ignoring his pathetic, entitled rambling. They grabbed his arms and forcefully twisted them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists sounded like the most beautiful music I had ever heard. Spencer struggled briefly, but the agents shoved him face first against the glass wall of the boardroom, thoroughly humiliating him in front of the entire city skyline. Gabrielle let out a blood-curdling scream and jumped out of her chair. "Spencer!" she cried, running toward him before the SEC investigators stepped in her path, blocking her from interfering with the federal arrest. "What are you doing to my husband? He did not do anything wrong. He is a millionaire." "Your husband is a criminal, Gabrielle," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady over the sound of her hysterical crying. "He is not a millionaire. He stole millions from your father and hid it in the Cayman Islands. The SEC is currently freezing his private equity fund and seizing every single personal asset tied to his name. He is going to spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary." Agent Carter read Spencer his Miranda rights, while the second agent began emptying Spencer's pockets, tossing his expensive wallet, his luxury watch, and his encrypted cell phone onto the conference table. Spencer was hyperventilating, tears of genuine terror streaming down his face. He looked over his shoulder at my father, pleading for help. "David, tell them I was just holding the money in escrow," Spencer begged, his voice completely stripped of all its former arrogance. "Tell them we had a verbal agreement. Please do not let them take me." My father just stared at him, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. He finally realized that the brilliant white savior he had trusted to rescue the family business had actually been the parasite draining its lifeblood. My father slowly sat back down in his chair, completely ignoring Spencer's pleas. He looked exactly like a man who had just watched his entire universe collapse. The federal agents pulled Spencer away from the glass and marched him toward the boardroom door. "Take a good look, Spencer," I called out just as they were about to drag him into the hallway. "Take a good look at what happens when you underestimate the quiet black woman in the room." Spencer opened his mouth to reply, but the FBI agents shoved him through the door, completely silencing him. The heavy glass door swung shut, leaving Gabrielle sobbing hysterically on the floor, pulling at her messy blonde hair. Vivian rushed over to her daughter, wrapping her arms around her, dropping to the floor in a pathetic heap of ruined designer fabric. "My life is over," Gabrielle wailed, burying her face in Vivian's shoulder. "What am I going to do, Mom? They are freezing all the accounts. How am I going to pay my credit card bills? How am I going to buy groceries?" I walked around the large mahogany table and stood directly over my weeping half-sister. "Your credit cards have already been permanently canceled, Gabrielle," I said, looking down at her with absolute indifference. "I contacted the corporate banking division at 6 o'clock this morning. Every single platinum card, black card, and expense account issued under the Holloway Management Group has been officially terminated. You have exactly 0 available credit." Gabrielle looked up at me, her makeup completely running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "You cannot do that, Gabby," she sobbed, holding out her hands as if begging for spare change. "I have a lifestyle to maintain. I have standing appointments. I am supposed to fly to Monaco next week." "You are not flying anywhere," I replied, crossing my arms. "In fact, you are not even driving home today." I reached into the pocket of my crimson blazer and pulled out a repossession order I had personally drafted and signed the night before. I dropped the piece of paper onto the floor right in front of her. The custom white Porsche you love driving around the city was leased under the corporate account, I explained. Because the management company is now entirely bankrupt and I am the senior creditor, I have legally repossessed the vehicle to settle outstanding corporate debts. The tow truck is currently waiting in the VIP parking garage downstairs. Hand over the keys right now, Gabrielle, or I will have the police add grand theft auto to your incredibly stressful morning. Vivian gasped, looking up at me with sheer, unadulterated hatred. You are a monster, Gabrielle, she hissed, holding her weeping daughter tight. You are enjoying this. You are systematically destroying your own sister over a car. She is not my sister, Vivian, I replied, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. She is a spoiled, entitled parasite who stood in the lobby last night and told me I was a forgotten mistake wearing garbage. Now she is sitting on the floor with no husband, no money, and no car. I would say the universe has simply corrected a massive imbalance. I held out my hand palm facing upward, demanding the keys. Brielle's hands shook violently as she reached into her expensive designer bag. She pulled out the heavy silver Porsche key fob and slowly placed it into my open palm. She looked like her physical heart had just been ripped entirely out of her chest. I closed my fingers around the keys, feeling the cold metal press into my skin. I had just entirely dismantled the golden child, reducing her to absolutely nothing in the span of 15 minutes. I turned my attention away from the sobbing women on the floor and looked directly at my father, who was still sitting frozen at the table. The federal agents had cleared the room of the most immediate threat, but the real cleanup was only just beginning. It was finally time to address the root cause of this entire disaster. It was time to deal with Vivian and the man who had enabled her for 17 years. I turned my attention away from the sobbing women on the floor and looked directly at my father. He was staring blankly at the empty chair where Spencer had been sitting just moments ago. He looked like a man who had completely lost his grip on reality. Vivian finally released her tight grip on Brielle and slowly stood up. She tried to smooth out the heavy wrinkles in her ruined emerald gown. Her hands were shaking violently, but she raised her chin, trying to salvage some tiny fraction of her former aristocratic dignity. There was absolutely nothing left to salvage, but she was too stubborn to accept her total defeat. Gabrielle, this has gone far enough, Vivian said, her voice trembling, but still laced with that familiar toxic entitlement. You proved your point, and you got rid of Spencer. We can all agree that he was a terrible man who took advantage of this family. But you cannot destroy your father over this. We are your blood. We can restructure the management company and put you in charge of the finances. I am willing to step down from the board of directors if that is what it takes to make you happy. I looked at her with absolute disgust. You do not have a seat on the board of directors to step down from, Vivian. I replied, my voice perfectly flat. You are offering me control of a sinking ship that is already resting at the bottom of the ocean. The management company does not just owe the trust $23 million. The financial rot you created goes much deeper than unpaid rent. I reached back into my leather briefcase and pulled out one final manila folder. It was thinner than the dossier I had given to the federal agents, but the contents were far more destructive to their marriage. I walked over to my father and dropped the folder onto the mahogany table right in front of him. Open it, I commanded. My father slowly lifted his head. His eyes were completely bloodshot and his skin looked gray in the bright morning sunlight pouring through the glass windows. He reached out with trembling fingers and opened the cover of the folder. He stared at the top document for a long time. His brow furrowed in deep confusion as he tried to comprehend the dense financial jargon and the aggressive interest rates printed on the page. What is this, Gabby? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. These look like loan agreements, but they are not from our corporate bank. Who is the Midwest Capital Group? They are a predatory lending firm, Dad, I explained, crossing my arms and looking down at him. They operate in the gray area of the law, providing massive short-term loans to desperate businesses at incredibly high interest rates. Traditional banks stopped lending you money 3 years ago because your debt-to-income ratio was entirely disastrous. But Vivian refused to stop spending. She needed cash to fund her luxury vacations and her expensive charity galas, so she went behind your back. She took out multiple black market loans using the management company as collateral. Vivian's face instantly turned the color of ash. She took a huge step backward, bumping into the glass wall of the boardroom. "That is a complete lie," she stammered, her eyes darting around the room looking for an escape. "I never took out any loans. I do not even know who those people are. You are fabricating more documents to turn my husband against me." My father flipped to the second page of the loan agreement. He stared at the bottom of the document. I saw the exact moment his heart completely shattered. He pointed a shaking finger at the ink on the page. "This is my signature," he said, looking up at me with profound confusion. "Gabby, my signature is right here on the authorization line. I authorized this." "Look closer, Dad," I said softly. He leaned in, staring intently at the curves and loops of the ink. The room was perfectly silent except for the sound of Brielle crying softly on the floor. My father slowly traced the signature with his index finger. He stopped at the final letter. He let out a sharp, agonizing gasp. "It was not your signature, Dad," I said, delivering the final devastating blow. "It is a brilliant forgery. Vivian spent 17 years watching you sign checks and corporate documents. She learned exactly how to mimic your handwriting. She forged your signature on every single one of those predatory loans. She borrowed over $8 million from dangerous lenders, and she spent every single dime on herself. She effectively sold your company to loan sharks just so she could keep wearing designer dresses and pretending she was the Queen of Chicago." My father slowly stood up from his chair. He turned and looked at the woman he had chosen over me. He had sacrificed his relationship with his own daughter to keep this woman happy, and she had repaid him by completely destroying his life. "You forged my name," he whispered, his voice breaking with absolute devastation. "You stole from me, and you lied to me. I gave you everything, Vivian. I gave you my entire life." Vivian began to cry, but there was no sympathy left for her in this room. "David, you have to understand," she pleaded, holding her hands out toward him. "I had to maintain our image. If society knew we were struggling, we would have lost all our influence. I was trying to protect our social standing. I was doing it for us." "You were doing it for yourself," my father yelled suddenly, slamming his fists down on the mahogany table. The sound echoed like thunder in the glass room. "You ruined me. You ruined my legacy. You are a complete monster." He collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands, weeping openly in front of me. I stood there watching the empire they had built on lies finally crumble into dust. Because of these predatory loans, the management company is carrying massive toxic debt. I announced, my voice echoing with absolute legal authority. The creditors are already preparing to seize the corporate assets, but there are no assets left to seize. Therefore, I am officially declaring the Holloway Management Group completely insolvent and bankrupt. And because the operating company owes the trust $23 million in unpaid rent, I am exercising my legal right as the primary landowner. I am officially seizing the physical hotel building, the land it sits on, and all remaining fixtures to cover the debt. The management company is effectively evicted as of this exact moment. My father did not argue. He just kept his face buried in his hands, sobbing quietly. Vivian slid down the glass wall until she was sitting on the floor next to Brielle. They were a pathetic portrait of ruined vanity and exposed greed. They had absolutely nothing left. I picked up the heavy black phone sitting in the center of the conference table and pressed the button for the main security desk. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Security desk, this is Marcus," the voice said. "Marcus, this is Gabrielle Holloway," I said, projecting my voice so my family could hear every single word. "I need you and another guard to come up to the 50th floor executive boardroom immediately. We have a situation that requires a physical escort." "Yes, Ms. Holloway," Marcus replied, his tone entirely respectful and prompt. "We are on our way up right now." I placed the phone back on the receiver. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy glass door of the boardroom swung open. Marcus and the tall guard from the lobby walked into the room. They were the exact same men Vivian had commanded to throw me out of the anniversary gala just 12 hours ago. They stood near the door looking at the pathetic scene before them. My father crying at the table and the two women sobbing on the floor. Marcus. Vivian shrieked, suddenly scrambling to her feet. She pointed a shaking finger at me. Arrest her right now, Marcus. She is trespassing in my boardroom. Remove her from this building immediately, or I will have your badge. Marcus did not even look at her. He kept his eyes completely focused on me, waiting for my explicit instructions. He knew exactly who signed his paychecks now. The entire hotel staff had already been informed of the massive change in ownership early this morning. Marcus, I said, gesturing toward my father and my stepmother. The Holloway Management Company has been officially evicted from the premises. David and Vivian are no longer authorized to be in the executive offices. Please escort them to their private suite downstairs. They have exactly 30 minutes to pack their personal clothing and toiletries. Do not let them take any corporate documents, any artwork, or any electronic devices. After 30 minutes, you will escort them out the front doors of the lobby and ensure they never step foot on my property again. Yes, Ms. Holloway, Marcus said, nodding firmly. He walked over to Vivian and placed a heavy hand on her arm. It was the exact same physical grip he had used on me the night before, but this time he was not apologizing. Let us go, ma'am, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. You have 30 minutes. Vivian tried to pull her arm away, but Marcus held firm. She looked back at me, her eyes burning with a hatred that would likely last for the rest of her miserable life. You are going to burn in hell, Gabrielle, she spat, her voice dripping with venom. I smiled calmly, looking perfectly at peace. I have already been to hell, Vivian, I replied. You sent me there when I was 15 years old. I just finally decided to crawl out and take the keys with me. Enjoy your new life. Marcus pulled her toward the door. Brielle scrambled to her feet and followed her mother, weeping hysterically about her ruined life and her arrested husband. The tall security guard walked over to my father. He gently tapped my father on the shoulder. It is time to go, sir, the guard said softly, showing a small amount of pity for the broken man. My father slowly stood up. He looked around the beautiful glass boardroom, taking in the massive mahogany table and the incredible view of the city. He had spent his entire life trying to look successful instead of actually doing the hard work to protect his legacy. He looked at me one final time. His eyes were filled with profound regret and a deep, lingering sorrow. I am sorry, Gabby, he whispered, his voice cracking. I am so sorry for everything. I did not offer him forgiveness. I did not offer him a warm smile or a word of comfort. I simply nodded, acknowledging his words without accepting his apology. Some wounds were simply too deep to be healed with a single sorry at the end of a destructive lifetime. Goodbye, Dad, I said, turning my back on him and walking toward the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. I listened to the heavy footsteps of the security guards leading my father out of the room. The glass door swung shut with a soft click and the boardroom was finally completely silent. I was entirely alone. I stood in front of the massive windows looking out over the sprawling city of Chicago. The morning sun was climbing higher into the sky, casting a brilliant golden light over the skyscrapers and the deep blue water of the lake. The city looked beautiful and completely full of endless possibilities. I raised my hand and touched the vintage gold necklace resting against my collarbone. Grandma Hattie had started this empire with absolutely nothing. She had faced discrimination, poverty, and incredible hardship, but she had built a legacy of Black wealth and undeniable excellence. My father had almost let that legacy slip away entirely. He had almost handed our history over to arrogant vultures and greedy parasites, but I had stopped them. I had weaponized my education, my patience, and my absolute resilience to take back exactly what belonged to my bloodline. They thought they could push me into the shadows because I was quiet. They thought they could erase me because I refused to play their toxic games. But they fundamentally misunderstood the power of a woman who knows her own worth. When you build a fortress of independence and financial literacy, nobody can ever force you to sit at a table where you are not respected. You simply buy the entire building and build your own table. As I stood there looking out over my city, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. The trauma of my past no longer defined me. The emotional wounds my family inflicted had finally closed, leaving behind thick, unbreakable scars. I was the sole owner of the Holloway Hotel empire. I was a self-made black woman, standing at the absolute peak of the mountain, and the view was absolutely breathtaking. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace and secure your future? Have you ever had to build your own table because the people who were supposed to love you refused to save you a seat? I would love to hear your incredible stories of resilience and triumph in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of surviving toxic families and reclaiming your personal power. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that their quiet strength is their greatest weapon. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, your past does not dictate your future, and your absolute best days are always ahead of you.